The sound of the frying pan hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. That sharp noise cut through the chatter and laughter of the kitchen, freezing the moment. For a brief second, everything seemed to stop. The world around her seemed to freeze. Steam rose from the pots and pans, and the knives, which had always been flying around the space, now hung suspended in the air, as if too afraid to fall. Edina stood next to the sink, her bony hand clearly showing signs of calluses. Her eyes were shut, staring into the dull gray water in the sink without saying a word. Her wet hair clung to her ragged cap, but she paid no attention to the filth. All she wanted was to escape the threatening glares, the cold judgment from Derek. "Edina, can't you get one dish right?" Derek's voice roared, cutting through the silence like thunder. His words weren't a concern but an insult, full of contempt. Edina stood there, her body shrinking as if silence could protect her from the fiery waves of anger. She didn't dare to respond, didn't dare to fight back. Her nose could only grasp the faint breath of endurance. From a distant corner of the kitchen, Jackson saw everything. His old apron, cheap shoes, and the crooked name tag, but his eyes remained steady, unwavering. 14 days, 28 shifts, and no pay. He felt the thick air filled with grease and disdain, like a dark shadow pressing down on everything. The feeling of injustice had decided to choose Edina as its victim, not because she did anything wrong, but because she couldn't fight back. She was too small, too weak in a world that always weighed heavily on those who worked quietly. But in her silence, there was a strength, a patience that couldn't be expressed, let alone fully understood. And though Edina said nothing, though she stood there in exhaustion and depletion, she made Jackson think. His gaze didn't just hold contempt, but sympathy for someone who had been pushed to the limit. Edina wasn't an ordinary employee. She was a ghost in her own workplace, unseen, unappreciated, yet she silently existed, quietly enduring day by day. In that moment, Jackson knew he couldn't just stand by anymore. He knew he had to do something. The next day, a new face appeared in the kitchen. He staggered in, carrying a tray of food far too large for his weak hands. Just as he turned around, the tray slipped, and the plates clattered together, creating a sharp, shattering sound like broken glass. An angry chef cursed loudly. The young man hurried to pick up the tray, his hands trembling as if he were desperately trying to hold on to his job. Laughter erupted from the kitchen staff. One of them whispered, "He's only just started, and he's already like this. I bet he won't last more than a week." His uniform was old, the sleeves loose around his shoulders and tight at his waist, his shoes squeaking across the kitchen floor, and the name tag crooked, misaligned. He looked every bit the new guy, awkward and inexperienced, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every corner of the kitchen as if memorizing everything. He wasn't fumbling because he didn't understand. It was more like a nervous awkwardness, as if his body hadn't caught up with his mind. Edina stood by the sink, her gaze briefly meeting his as they exchanged the tray. A fleeting gesture, barely noticeable, but it sparked a subtle change. Not a connection, not sympathy, but a fragile thread of understanding in silence. Edina nodded gently, saying nothing, but she could feel that she wasn't the only one living within this invisible wall. He too, though new, was facing this silent system. As always, Derek appeared when tensions were high. He walked over to the counter, wearing his polished smile, his sweet tone masking the arrogance lurking beneath. "Sorry for the inconvenience," Derek said, his voice smooth, almost undetectable in its insincerity. A customer smiled, relaxed, agreeing to wait a little longer. But when Derek turned back, the smile faded from his face like it had never been there. His eyes scanned the kitchen, his voice booming like thunder. "Who messed up this order? Who can't read a simple ticket?" His words sliced through the air, and the kitchen fell silent. Edina stood still, her body stiffening. Derek's eyes inevitably turned toward her, as if it had become an unavoidable habit. "It's you again," Derek said, devoid of any pity. She lowered her head, as if shame was the only shield she could use to protect herself from the next onslaught. A young chef, whispering under his breath but loud enough for Edina to hear, muttered, "Keep quiet, that's the only way to survive." She nodded slightly, saying nothing, accepting a rule she had long since grown accustomed to. But amid the clanging knives and rising steam, Jackson saw it all. He witnessed the stark contradiction. Derek, sweet and friendly with customers, yet ruling his staff with fear. To the customers, Derek was a kind owner, but to the employees, he was a tyrant. Jackson realized this wasn't just a kitchen, it was a system built on fear, on silencing voices that would otherwise speak up. And Idana, though there, was an invisible figure, unnoticed by anyone, but bearing the weight of suffering that no one could see. From that moment on, Jackson knew he couldn't just stand by anymore. He had to do something. The next morning, after another long, exhausting night of silence, Jackson returned to the kitchen. He had no special reason to be there, other than to continue observing, continuing to take in everything that was happening around him. He walked through the dining area, where customers were still happily eating, unaware that behind the scenes, everything was still taking place under a silent veil of fear. Jackson carried a tray of food, placed it on an empty table, and sat down. He didn't look at the food, but rather at the work happening around him. Adana stood by the sink, her hands gliding over the plates, each movement calm and deliberate. She didn't pay attention to the noise of the kitchen or the eyes passing over her. Every action she took was part of the system, part of a silence that had been established long ago. No one in the kitchen spoke. No one interacted with one another. They just worked and lived through each day without a word. Derek, as always, appeared when tensions were high. He walked between the stations with the same controlling presence, issuing orders with a cold, detached tone. His voice was authoritative, and it never wavered. He continued to hold the power, ruling through fear, using criticism and intimidation to keep everyone in line. To customers, he was warm and polite, but to his staff, he was ruthless, ruling with an iron fist. Jackson began to realize something important. Derek's commands weren't just words thrown into the air. They were doors everyone had to pass through, doors filled with threats and intimidation. The people working here weren't just serving food, they were serving Derek's fear, enduring the tyranny that he had imposed on them. The workers didn't speak up, didn't protest. They were too afraid, too silenced by the oppressive atmosphere. One day, after the rush had calmed down and the kitchen was quieter, Jackson walked closer to the counter where Idana was still working, washing the dishes as she always did, her hands rough and red from the constant work. He stood there for a moment, watching her, then made a decision in his mind. "Edina," Jackson called gently. She looked up but still continued her work, not saying anything. The silence was thick around them, but it wasn't just hers anymore. Jackson saw the quiet strength in her. She wasn't just enduring the work, she was silently protesting everything that had been done to her. "You don't have to work alone like this," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "I see what's going on here, and I'm not just going to stand by." Edna didn't respond right away. She kept washing the dishes, but after a brief pause, she looked at him. There wasn't fear in her eyes, but there was something else, something softer. It was as if she had started to believe that she wasn't the only one who could see the truth. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly, her voice low, but there was no fear now. "If I stand up, I lose everything. Not just the job, but everything." Jackson stood still, watching her. "We all have a choice. We can't just keep living in silence. No one deserves to be treated like this," he said gently, but with unwavering conviction. "The job isn't everything, Idana, but your dignity, your self-respect, that's the most important thing." Idana didn't answer immediately, but there was something in the way she looked at him, something that told him she was beginning to understand. She stood a little straighter, her posture slightly different, though she didn't speak. Her silence this time was no longer one of fear. It was a silent acknowledgement that she didn't have to endure this alone. When Derek walked by a little later, Jackson didn't move. His eyes were locked on Derek, and his presence alone spoke volumes. Derek could sense the tension in the air, but he didn't say anything. He just walked past, continuing his usual routine. But this time, Jackson wasn't standing idly by anymore. Idana continued her work, but there was a difference in the way she carried herself. She no longer seemed to shrink in the face of Derek's commands. She didn't cower under his glare. She was still doing the same tasks, but now there was a quiet power in her movements. Jackson knew from that moment that things would never be the same. Idana had taken the first step toward breaking the silence, toward reclaiming her dignity, and now he couldn't walk away either. The change had already begun, and he was ready to stand by her, ready to fight the silence, together. The next day, the kitchen was still full of noise. The sizzling of pans, the clattering of knives, the rush of orders coming in. But something had changed. The atmosphere was different, lighter in a way that was almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. It felt like a shift, a small but significant crack in the weight of silence that had once loomed over the kitchen. Derek still entered the kitchen with his usual cold demeanor, walking with the same air of authority, but this time his presence didn't command the same fear. His steps were measured, his posture still rigid, but he seemed to feel the change in the air. For the first time, he realized the grip he once had over the kitchen was loosening, and it unsettled him. Edina, standing by the sink, washed the dishes as she always did, but this time, there was no rush in her movements. Her hands, though still worn from the work, moved with purpose and calm. She didn't look up when Derek walked by, nor did she flinch as his gaze flickered toward her. She simply continued working, the steady rhythm of her actions a quiet protest, a refusal to be intimidated any longer. Jackson watched this change in her. He noticed how her shoulders were no longer slumped, how her movements had become more deliberate and confident. There was no longer fear in her eyes when she caught Derek's glance. In fact, she didn't seem to care at all about his presence anymore. She was working for herself now, not for him. Derek, though, was not oblivious. He could feel the shift, but his pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge it. Instead, he doubled down, walking through the kitchen with more force, barking orders louder than usual. But his words fell flat. The staff didn't cower anymore. They had begun to see the cracks in his power, and they were starting to understand that they didn't have to live in silence either. Jackson stood silently by the counter, observing everything that was happening. He was seeing the transformation in Adana, but he also knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the collective will of the people in this kitchen. People who had long been silenced, who had long accepted their fate as invisible workers. Now they were slowly starting to speak out with their actions, with their confidence, and it was clear that the tide was turning. Derek stopped in his tracks when he reached the counter, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the kitchen staff. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, and for the first time, he couldn't control it. He didn't know why, but the power he once held over them was slipping away, and it frightened him. He could sense the defiance in the air, the quiet uprising that was slowly but surely taking shape. "Adana," Derek called out, his voice as sharp as ever. She didn't look up. She didn't even acknowledge him. Jackson saw the subtle change in Derek's expression. He was growing frustrated, but it was clear that he was losing control. Edina, for her part, didn't seem affected by his command. She didn't flinch, didn't hurry to respond. She was simply doing her job, but this time, she was doing it on her terms. Jackson felt a surge of something inside him. He was witnessing the change he had hoped for, the one he knew had to happen. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it wasn't a confrontation, but it was just as powerful. The silence that had once been a tool for control was now being transformed into a source of strength. Edina wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving in her quiet defiance. As the hours passed and the kitchen began to wind down, Jackson made his way over to Adana, who was still working diligently. He stood beside her for a moment before speaking. "You're not just surviving anymore, are you?" Jackson said quietly, his voice calm but filled with understanding. Edina looked at him, her face soft but resolute. "No, I'm not. I'm finally starting to live for myself." Jackson smiled slightly. "Good. That's exactly what needs to happen." "Oh." They both stood in silence for a moment, their shared understanding hanging in the air between them. Jackson knew that this was just the beginning. Derek's control over the kitchen was slipping, and he couldn't hold on to it forever. It wasn't just Adana who had changed. It was all of them. The kitchen was no longer a place where fear reigned. It was slowly becoming a place where people could find their voices, where they could stand tall, even in the smallest of ways. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson believed that real change was possible. The walls of silence had been cracked, and the truth was beginning to seep through. Derek, still unaware of how close he was to losing everything, continued his patrol. But now he did so with a growing sense of unease. The kitchen was no longer his to command. The truth had started to take root, and there was no turning back. A week passed since Jackson decided he could no longer stand by. The atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted. Though the usual sounds of sizzling pans, clanging knives, and orders being shouted continued, there was a subtle difference in the air, an invisible force of change. Everything was still operating as usual, but there was a palpable shift, a new energy in the space that was impossible to ignore. Derek still walked through the kitchen with his usual cold, controlling air, barking orders and maintaining his iron grip on everything. But something was different today. As he moved through the kitchen, he felt the weight of the change, the power he once held slipping from his grasp. For the first time, Derek realized that his dominance over the kitchen staff was waning, and it unsettled him. Edina stood by the sink, washing the dishes as always. But today, something had changed in her too. Her movements were no longer rushed. Her hands, though still weathered from the work, moved with purpose and calm. She didn't look up when Derek passed by, nor did she flinch as his eyes scanned her. She simply continued her work, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't shrinking under his gaze. Jackson watched this transformation in Edina. He noticed how she stood taller, how her eyes no longer held fear when they met Derek's gaze. There was a quiet power in her movements now. She wasn't just enduring the work, she was silently resisting it. She had begun to reclaim her power, and Jackson could see it. Derek, of course, noticed nothing. His pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge the shift. Instead, he continued with his usual tactics, his voice growing louder, his commands more forceful, trying to reassert his control. But it was clear, his words had lost their weight. The kitchen staff no longer cowered in fear. They weren't afraid of him anymore. They were beginning to see that they didn't have to. Jackson knew that this moment wasn't just about Edina. It was about the collective will of the people in the kitchen. The workers who had long been silent, who had accepted their fates as invisible laborers, were slowly starting to speak out in their own way. They were finding their confidence, and the tide was turning. Derek stopped at the counter, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the change in the air but didn't know how to confront it. He continued to bark orders, but his words seemed to lose their power. The staff didn't flinch as they once had. They weren't afraid anymore. Edina, Derek's voice sliced through the air, but she didn't look up. She didn't respond. Jackson noticed the change in Derek's expression. He was growing frustrated, but he couldn't understand why. He was losing control, and for the first time it frightened him. Edina, however, seemed unaffected. She wasn't intimidated by his voice, his authority. She was simply working, doing her job on her terms. Jackson stood back, watching everything unfold. He could see it clearly now, the beginning of a quiet rebellion, a resistance that wasn't loud or violent, but powerful in its own way. Edina was not just surviving anymore. She was starting to thrive. And Jackson knew he couldn't stand by and watch anymore. He had to be part of this change. He couldn't be a passive observer any longer. The shift had begun, and he was ready to stand beside Edina and everyone else who was starting to find their voice. The change was already happening. The next day, the atmosphere in the kitchen was different. The usual heat, the sizzling of pans, and the clanging of knives still filled the air. But now there was something more, something deeper. The tension, the fear that had once been a constant presence, seemed to have lifted. It wasn't gone entirely, but there was a noticeable shift. Derek entered as usual, his demeanor cold and commanding, his authority unwavering, but he was no longer the unquestioned ruler. Something had changed, and he felt it. For the first time, Derek realized that the power he once held over the kitchen was slipping away. The staff no longer cowered in fear. They were no longer his to control, and that unsettled him. Edina stood at the sink, her hands moving over the dishes with a calm, steady rhythm. She didn't rush her movements anymore, and her posture had shifted too. Her shoulders were straighter, her stance more grounded. She didn't look up as Derek passed by, nor did she flinch under his gaze. She simply continued her work, her face expressionless, but there was a quiet strength in her movements. She wasn't shrinking from him anymore. She was quietly defying him, asserting her power in her own way. Jackson watched all of this from the corner of the kitchen. He saw the transformation in Adana, how she had changed, how her demeanor had shifted from one of silent suffering to one of quiet resistance. Her body language had changed. She stood taller, more confident, as if she had finally realized her worth. She wasn't just enduring the work anymore. She was taking back control of her life. Derek, of course, was oblivious to these changes. His pride wouldn't allow him to recognize the shift in the room. Instead, he continued to bark orders, his voice loud and insistent, trying to reassert control, but his words didn't have the same power they once did. The staff was no longer afraid of him. They were no longer afraid to stand tall, to do their work with dignity. Jackson could feel the change happening, and he knew it wasn't just about Adana anymore. It was about all the workers in the kitchen, about every person who had been silenced, who had been forced to accept the oppressive atmosphere that Derek had created. They were starting to speak up with their actions, with their confidence, and Jackson realized that this was only the beginning. As Derek continued to parade through the kitchen, giving orders and demanding perfection, Jackson saw the shift in the workers. They were no longer reacting to his commands with fear. Instead, they moved with purpose and confidence. They were starting to take back control of their lives, their work, and their dignity. Derek stopped at the counter, his eyes scanning the kitchen. He could feel the shift in the air, but he didn't understand it. His eyes landed on Adana, but she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. She was working on her terms now, not his. Jackson could feel the tension building. It wasn't in the air, but in the way the kitchen was responding to Derek. There was a subtle defiance now, a resistance that was quietly growing. The workers were no longer afraid to assert their rights, to stand up for themselves. And Adana, who had once been invisible, who had silently endured everything Derek threw at her, was leading that change. Jackson stepped forward, his presence no longer just one of observation, but of action. He was ready to stand beside Adana, to support the shift that was happening in the kitchen. He couldn't stand by and watch anymore. The truth was out, and the workers were beginning to realize their power. Derek, for the first time, felt a loss of control. He looked around the kitchen, trying to reassert himself, but the power was no longer his. He was losing his grip, and the staff was starting to see it. The kitchen wasn't his domain anymore. It was theirs. And in that moment, Jackson knew this was just the beginning. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The next morning, when the soft light of dawn began to filter through the kitchen windows, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The usual heat from the stove, the clattering of pans, the sound of orders being shouted, everything felt like it was in place. Yet there was an undeniable shift in the air. The tension that had once filled the kitchen was gone, or at least it was lighter than before. The staff didn't cower anymore. The fear that used to hang over them like a shadow had begun to dissipate. Derek walked into the kitchen as he usually did, his posture rigid, his voice commanding. But something had changed. The usual authority he wielded over everyone no longer seemed as potent. He could feel it, the subtle shift, the change in the air, the quiet defiance that was beginning to take root. His power, once absolute, was beginning to slip from his grasp, and it made him uneasy. Edna stood by the sink, washing the dishes with a steady rhythm. Her movements were calm and deliberate. Her hands, still rough and red from the constant work, moved with a quiet strength. She didn't look up as Derek passed by, nor did she flinch under his gaze. She simply continued with her task. Her body language had changed. She was no longer shrinking under his scrutiny. She stood tall, her posture more confident. There was no fear in her eyes now. Jackson noticed the transformation in her. She wasn't just enduring the work anymore. She had begun to reclaim her power. Every movement she made, every action she took, was now done on her terms. There was no more shrinking back, no more silent submission. She was quietly standing up for herself, and Jackson could see it. Derek, of course, noticed none of this. His pride, his ego, wouldn't allow him to see the change in the atmosphere. Instead, he continued with his usual commands, loud, demanding, trying to maintain control. But his words didn't carry the same weight as they once had. The staff wasn't afraid of him anymore. They no longer reacted to his orders with the same fear they once did. They were beginning to realize they didn't have to. Jackson knew that this moment wasn't just about Idana, it was about all of them. It was about everyone in the kitchen who had silently endured Derek's reign of fear, who had accepted his dominance out of necessity. Now they were all starting to find their voices, and Jackson was ready to stand beside them, to support them as they took back their power. Derek, still oblivious to the shift, walked through the kitchen with his usual air of superiority. He tried to bark orders to reassert his dominance, but it was clear that the power was no longer his. The kitchen staff was no longer afraid. They were starting to stand up for themselves. When Derek stopped at the counter, his eyes scanned the room. He looked at Idana, who continued to wash the dishes without acknowledging him. He felt a flicker of frustration in his chest, but he didn't show it. Instead, he turned his attention to the rest of the kitchen. But this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. Idana, for her part, stood taller. She didn't look at Derek, didn't acknowledge him in any way. She simply continued with her work, and that in itself was a form of resistance. Jackson watched all of this, the subtle shift that was happening right in front of him. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was powerful. Idana had begun to take back her power, and the others in the kitchen were starting to follow her lead. Derek's authority was slipping, and he didn't even realize it. Jackson knew that this moment was crucial. It wasn't just about confronting Derek. It was about creating a space where the staff could be seen, heard, and respected. And in that moment, Jackson made a decision. He couldn't just be an observer anymore. He had to take action. He walked toward Idana, standing beside her, not in the shadows anymore, but right next to her. He looked at her, his gaze full of understanding and support. "You don't have to do this alone," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady. Idana looked up at him, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. A small but powerful smile. "I know," she said softly. They stood together, not as employees in a broken system, but as individuals ready to reclaim their dignity. It was no longer about surviving the workplace. It was about changing it. Derek, sensing the shift, took a step back. His eyes darted around the kitchen, his sense of control slipping through his fingers. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew he was losing his grip. The truth was out in the open now. The staff had begun to realize their worth, and there was no going back. Derek could try to exert control, but it was clear that his reign was coming to an end. Idana had started the change, and now everyone else was following her lead. Together, they were standing up for themselves, and Jackson knew they wouldn't stop until they had created a new kind of workplace, one where fear didn't dictate their every move. As Jackson stood beside Idana, he knew that this was just the beginning. The battle wasn't over, but they had already won the most important thing, their voices. And with their voices came the power to change everything. Derek could try to fight it, but the truth had already begun to take hold, and nothing could stop it now. Since that moment, the kitchen was no longer filled with tension, nor was it under the heavy shadow of fear that once ruled it. Instead, it had become a space where each person could stand tall, no longer having to shrink or hide in silence. Every dish, every task, was no longer just mundane work. It had become a symbol of dedication, respect, and the recognition of everyone's worth. Idana stood in the vast kitchen, a sense of tranquility washing over her. She was no longer invisible, no longer crushed under the weight of Derek's tyranny or the silence of the system. She had become part of something greater, a change that she had initiated, and now that change was blooming. Jackson stood nearby, watching her. His eyes followed her every movement, noticing how her actions had become more purposeful, more confident. She was no longer just getting by. She was thriving. Every time she looked around, she now saw people who respected her, who recognized her power. She wasn't a ghost in the kitchen anymore. She was an integral part of the team. The kitchen staff had changed too. They no longer feared Derek's presence. They no longer acted out of duty or submission. They worked with purpose and dignity. They communicated openly, helping one another, sharing stories, and even laughing together. What had once been a place of silent suffering was now a space of camaraderie, of collective strength. Jackson saw all of this. He had watched it all unfold, from Idana's quiet rebellion to the silent but powerful movement that had spread throughout the kitchen. They were no longer working in fear, they were working with respect. The dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, the kitchen felt like a real team. And Jackson was proud to be part of that team. Derek, as usual, walked into the kitchen, but his usual confidence seemed to have faded. His steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he sensed the change but couldn't fully understand it. His usual arrogance had disappeared, replaced by a lingering uncertainty. He looked around, but instead of the usual fearful glances, he was met with steady eyes and straightened backs. His gaze landed on Adana, who continued working with a quiet confidence. She didn't flinch when he looked at her. She didn't shrink back or try to avoid his gaze. She simply carried on with her work, focused, determined. Derek's frustration grew, but there was nothing he could do. His grip on the kitchen, on his power, was slipping. Jackson stood by Adana, silently supporting her. He had seen the change in her, the quiet power she now radiated. She no longer needed to hide. She was free. She had reclaimed herself, and in doing so, had paved the way for everyone else in the kitchen to do the same. The air was different now. The tension had been replaced by a quiet strength, a newfound dignity in everyone's movements. And it was clear, the kitchen was no longer Derek's domain. It belonged to those who had found their voices, to those who no longer feared him. Derek, still trying to assert his control, failed to realize that the game had changed. The power had shifted, and there was no turning back. The workers in the kitchen had risen up, not with anger or defiance, but with quiet strength, and they had already won. Edna had started the change, and now everyone was following her lead. They had found their voices, and with those voices, they had taken back their power. They had changed the system, not through confrontation, but through resilience, and their lives in the kitchen would never be the same again. As Jackson stood beside Adana, he knew this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but they had won something far more important: their dignity. They had reclaimed their worth, and nothing could take that away from them. And in the midst of the kitchen, in the quiet defiance of Adana, in the newfound strength of the team, the truth shone through. They were no longer victims of silence. They were free, and they had created a space where everyone could be seen and heard. The light that had once seemed so far away was now within their reach, and they knew they would never let it go. The kitchen remained bustling with activity, but the atmosphere had undeniably changed. The usual noise of sizzling pans, clinking knives, and shouted orders still filled the space, but now it was lighter, more relaxed. The tension that once hovered in every corner had dissipated. The staff no longer shrank in fear, no longer tiptoed around Derek's dominance. They were starting to stand tall, not just because they had to, but because they could. Edna walked through the kitchen with a new sense of confidence. She no longer slouched or hid in the corners. She moved with purpose, each step reflecting her newfound strength. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she wasn't going to let anyone treat her as such. Jackson watched her from a distance. He could see the transformation clearly, how her actions had become more deliberate, how she engaged with the other staff, how she wasn't afraid anymore. He saw how the others were beginning to follow her lead. They were finding their voices, and that made all the difference. Derek, on the other hand, still walked with his usual swagger, but today there was something different in his posture. His eyes darted around, trying to find the source of this new shift in the kitchen. He noticed that his commands were being met with silence, or worse, with firm, steady gazes. The staff was no longer looking down at the floor when he spoke. They weren't afraid of him anymore. It unsettled him. Edna stood by the sink, her hands moving over the dishes with a steady rhythm. Derek walked past her, but this time Adana didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head. She didn't shrink back. She stood tall, confident in her work. She wasn't waiting for approval. She didn't need it. Jackson, watching from the corner, knew that this moment had been coming. It wasn't about one person taking control. It was about everyone in the kitchen finding their power, their voice. They had all seen what Adana had done, how she had silently taken back what was hers. And now they were starting to do the same. Derek continued to bark orders, but his voice wasn't as sharp as it used to be. He didn't have the same power over the room. The staff was moving differently, working with more purpose, and no longer living in fear. They were taking back their dignity, and they were doing it together. As Jackson looked around the kitchen, he realized that the change had already begun. It was no longer about the things that Derek had controlled. It was about the things that they, the workers, controlled. They were no longer just a machine that ran on fear and intimidation. They were people with voices, with worth, and with strength. When Derek looked up, he saw the transformation in the room. He saw the quiet defiance in the staff's eyes, the way they worked with confidence instead of fear. For the first time, he felt a twinge of uncertainty. The control he once had was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jackson knew that the road ahead would not be easy. They had made progress, but there was still work to be done. Derek was still in charge for now, but the foundation had been laid. The workers had started to find their voices, and they weren't going to let them be silenced again. Edna had led the way. Now it was time for the rest of the kitchen to follow. Together, they would take back what was theirs. Together, they would create a space where everyone's worth was recognized and where no one had to live in silence again. And with that, Jackson felt a sense of hope. Hope for what could come next. Hope for the future they were building. A future where change was no longer a distant dream, but a reality they could touch. The journey wasn't over, but it had already begun, and no one was going back to the way things were before. That afternoon, the warm golden light of the setting sun filtered through the kitchen windows, creating a soft, dreamlike glow. Idana stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking around at the space she had once viewed as a prison. Now it felt different, lighter, freer. She wasn't just working anymore. She was living, and her presence filled the room with a quiet strength. The shift wasn't immediate. It hadn't been easy, but the change had begun, and Idana could feel it in the way the kitchen operated. The atmosphere was no longer clouded by fear and silence. It had become a space where people respected one another, where every task was done with purpose, not out of obligation. Each dish was no longer a chore. It had become a symbol of the dignity and pride the workers had reclaimed. Jackson stood at a distance, watching Idana. He saw how she moved with confidence, how she carried herself differently. She wasn't the same person who had silently endured the oppressive atmosphere. She had transformed into someone who was finally seen, heard, and respected. And as he looked around the room, he saw that others were beginning to follow her lead. They no longer worked in the shadows. They stood tall, proud of what they did, and they knew they deserved respect. Derek entered the kitchen, his usual cold and commanding presence still intact. But today, something was off. His eyes darted around, sensing that the control he once had was slipping away. He could see the change in the staff, and it unnerved him. They weren't afraid anymore. They didn't tremble when he spoke. They met his gaze with calm confidence. When he walked past Idana, he expected her to shrink back as she once had, but she didn't. She stood firm, continuing her work, unaffected by his presence. Derek couldn't understand it. For the first time, he realized that the power dynamic had shifted, and he didn't know how to regain control. Jackson watched all of this, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He could feel the transformation, not just in Idana, but in everyone. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living with dignity. They had found their voice, and they were using it. The kitchen was no longer a place of fear. It was a place where people worked with pride and purpose. Derek's dominance was fading, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The staff had come together, and they were strong, united in their quiet defiance. As the evening shift came to an end, Jackson approached Idana. He had seen the change in her, but he knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but he felt a sense of hope. This was just the beginning. "You've done something amazing here," Jackson said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. Edna looked up at him, her expression calm, but filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it alone," she said softly, "but we've done it. We've made a difference." Jackson nodded. "Yes, we have, and we'll keep going, together." They stood in the kitchen, no longer feeling like outsiders or silent workers. They had found their voices, and now they would continue to speak out, to stand tall, and to change the system that had once kept them down. The journey was far from over, but Idana and Jackson knew that they had already taken the most important step. The kitchen, once a place of fear and silence, had become a place of strength and unity. And it was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where no one would ever have to hide again. The kitchen, once a place of long days and unbearable tension for Idana, had now transformed into a space filled with respect and empathy. No longer forgotten, Idana herself no longer sank into exhaustion or accepted the silence that had once defined her existence. Every step she took felt lighter, every word she spoke clearer, and most importantly, full of confidence. However, like any other journey, change didn't come easily. Though progress had been made, there remained an unspoken truth that Jackson and Idana both knew. No one could stand still forever if they merely dealt with their pain in silence. One afternoon, as the final rays of daylight stretched through the kitchen windows, Jackson entered the kitchen again, immediately sensing an unusual tension in the air. It wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of the kitchen, it was something else. The atmosphere was charged with an undercurrent of tension, as though something unsaid hung in the air. Something everyone knew but no one dared to confront. As Jackson stopped by the counter, his eyes accidentally fell on a piece of forgotten paperwork left on the shelf. It was just a scrap of paper, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. It contained details about certain decisions, approvals, and names that were odd and out of place, things Jackson had never noticed before. The words on the paper felt like a warning, a truth staring him right in the face. This is about Derek, Jackson muttered under his breath, not wanting to alarm Idana but realizing the significance of what he had found. Idana, sensing the shift in his mood, walked over quietly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice calm, yet he could tell she was prepared to face whatever the truth was. Jackson held up the piece of paper, his voice laced with doubt and suspicion. "These names, these decisions, everything leads to one person. Derek isn't just a kitchen manager. He's part of a larger system, an abusive system no one here ever saw." Edna sighed as though a wall inside her had crumbled. She had known it for a while, but now it was all coming to light. The years of mistreatment, the unfair decisions, the manipulations. But now the truth was no longer hidden. It was time to face it. "We have to do something about this," Idana said firmly, her voice no longer filled with fear, but with quiet resolve. "We can't keep letting this happen. I won't stand by anymore." Jackson looked at her, and for the first time he felt that she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone. She was no longer the silent worker who just endured. She was the voice of the people, the catalyst for change. "We'll bring it to light," Jackson said with certainty. "No one should suffer in silence anymore. Not here, not ever." A decision had been made. There would be no more waiting, no more enduring. They would confront the truth, and they would face it together. The kitchen, once a place where secrets were buried under the weight of silence, was about to see a revolution, one that would no longer tolerate the abuse and manipulation that had been allowed to flourish. It wasn't just about standing up for themselves anymore. It was about standing together as a united front, ready to expose the truth. With the discovery in hand, Jackson and Idana were ready to take action. They weren't alone anymore. They had the support of the staff, the power of truth, and the determination to bring justice where it had long been absent. As they prepared for what was next, they both knew that the system would never be the same. No one could hide the truth anymore. Not Derek, not the system, and certainly not the people who had suffered in silence for so long. The time for change had arrived, and it would be a change they would lead. The next day, the atmosphere in the kitchen was different. The usual heat from the stoves and the noise of cooking filled the air, but now there was something else, something palpable. The kitchen, once a place full of tension and fear, had become a space of quiet revolution. It wasn't just the work that had changed, it was the energy, the mood, the way everyone moved and interacted with one another. Derek, as usual, walked into the kitchen with his typical air of arrogance and authority. But today there was a noticeable shift. His footsteps weren't as sure as they once were. The look of control he once had over the room was slipping away, and he could feel it. His eyes scanned the kitchen, trying to detect the source of the change. But all he saw were the same workers, moving with purpose, standing tall. They weren't afraid anymore. Idana, standing at the sink, looked over her shoulder and saw Derek enter. Normally, she would shrink away, avoiding his gaze, but today she didn't. She stood tall, focusing on her task, not bothered by his presence. The fear that once dictated her actions had disappeared. She didn't have to shrink anymore. She was reclaiming her space in the kitchen, and with every passing moment, she grew stronger. Jackson observed from the corner of the kitchen. He had watched Adana's transformation, and now he could see it in the other staff members too. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They weren't hiding their discomfort or pretending to be invisible. They were standing with their heads high, working with pride, and most importantly, they were standing together. The shift was palpable. Derek tried to regain his old power, barking orders and trying to assert his dominance, but it was no use. His words no longer had the same effect. The staff, once terrified of his anger, now met him with a quiet defiance. They were no longer afraid of the consequences. They had found their voices, and they weren't going to be silenced anymore. At one point, Derek stopped and looked around, sensing the tension in the air. His usual control was gone. He found himself questioning what was happening. The workers weren't shaking in fear. They weren't looking down anymore. They were looking up. They were looking at him, and they were no longer afraid. Jackson stood beside Adana, quietly supporting her. He knew this was just the beginning. The kitchen wasn't perfect, and the road ahead wasn't easy, but it had changed, and they had taken the first steps toward a more just, respectful place for everyone. Derek approached the counter, trying to command attention with his usual harsh tone. But there was a difference today. No one flinched. No one cowered. The workers continued their tasks, eyes fixed on their work, no longer afraid to face the reality of the situation. Adana, standing firm, looked at Derek without fear. She wasn't looking for a confrontation, but she also wasn't going to back down. Her strength was not in her words, but in her presence. She had changed. She had found the power within herself to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone in the kitchen. And Derek, for the first time, couldn't control the room. The power he had once held had slipped away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jackson watched the scene unfold. He knew this was the beginning of something much bigger. The kitchen wasn't just going to be a place of work anymore. It was going to be a place of respect, a place where everyone had a voice and where fear no longer dictated their actions. The workers had begun to see their own worth, and that made all the difference. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were standing tall, and they were doing it together. The battle wasn't over, but it had already begun. And as Jackson looked at Adana, standing strong in the face of everything, he knew that they were on the path to something bigger than just changing a kitchen. They were changing the system, and that was only the beginning. In that moment, Jackson realized the truth. When people stand together, they have the power to change everything. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.